Hi everyone, welcome back to Learn with me. I'm Deborah Hanson, and today we're going to look at AP Psychology 4.2, Attitude Formation and Attitude Change. So before we get started, thank you so much to everybody who has subscribed to the channel. The numbers are going up, which is great, and I love it. And thank you again for doing that. I appreciate it. So here we go. We're going to start with the first CED question. There are two CED questions for 4.2, Attitude Formation and Attitude Change. So I'm going to break it into two videos like I did in the 4.1, just to make it a little bit more manageable and easier for you to understand. And we'll go into lots of detail so that we understand the essential knowledge and we can apply that to either MCQs or FRQs. Here we go. So on this slide, you're going to see the key terms for this particular section of Unit 4. And as always, I'm going to make a separate video for you with the definitions and real life examples. Now, of course, we're going to be talking about these key terms in this video, and we're going to talk about how the definitions and how it examples and all of these things so that you can understand it really well. And the separate video is really almost like just like definition, example, just to help you make your flashcards so that you can know the key terms and be able to apply them on a unit test or the AP exam. So the first CED question for 4.2 Attitude Formation and Attitude Change is explain how stereotypes and implicit attitudes contribute to behaviors and mental processes of prejudice and discrimination. Gee, that was a whole mouthful, wasn't it? Okay, so let's get started. We're going to look at the essential knowledge that goes with this particular question. So before we dive into it, we're just going to do a little review of attribution theory, which we looked at in 4.1. So we're going to look at the definition again, which is attribution theory explains how people interpret and explain the causes of behavior and mental processes, attributing them to either internal, dispositional, or external, situational factors. And why did that matter? It matters because attributions influence how we perceive ourselves and others, which shapes our behavior, attitudes, and social interactions. And the key concept here is that attribution theory is tied to biases, stereotypes, and attitudes that affect our judgment and our actions. So we're going to go into all of those right now, and we're going to break it all down into the essential knowledge. If you want to follow along with the full slideshow, you'll find the link below, as well as a little workbook with some questions and things to get you thinking about the content. So you'll find the link in the description below. Okay, now let's get going. So we're going to talk about stereotypes and how they connect with attribution theory and how they shape how we perceive and explain behavior. So stereotypes simplify like social information, but they can often lead to biases, judgments, and attributions. So let's break it down really simply. What are stereotypes? So that is basically generalized concepts or assumptions about a group of people. So they tend to oversimplify characteristics and often don't account for individual differences, and it makes them inaccurate and unfair. So let's look at the role in cognition for this. So why do stereotypes exist? Okay, so they help us simplify complex social information. So instead of evaluating every individual we meet, stereotypes are kind of like a shortcut. It reduces the cognitive effort that we need to process a social interaction. However, simplifying it like this comes at a cost because stereotypes can often lead to overgeneralizations, where we apply assumptions about a group to an individual without really considering their unique circumstances. So, how do stereotypes affect our behavior? Well, they heavily influence how we attribute behavior, because according to attribution theory, we explain others' actions as being caused by either internal or dispositional or external or situational factors. So when stereotypes come into play, people will often rely on dispositional attributions for group behavior. Here's an example for you. If a student struggles academically, someone influenced by stereotypes might assume it's due to the group they belong to, rather than individual circumstances like a lack of resources or just having a tough personal situation. So, what is the behavioral impact of this? This biased attribution basically has real consequences, right? It reinforces negative stereotypes, it perpetuates cycles of prejudice and discrimination, and they can often lead to unfair treatment, where individuals are actually judged not for their actions or abilities, but on a generalized belief about their group. So why does this all matter? Understanding how stereotypes interact with attribution theory helps us to recognize and challenge biases in our thinking. So by reflecting on whether our attributions are based on stereotypes or genuine understanding, we can make fairer and more accurate judgments. So stereotypes might seem like mental shortcuts, but they can distort how we explain behavior or treat others. So let's strive to move forward and beyond these assumptions and really focus on individual circumstances. Okay, so now let's explore the connection between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. and how they relate to attribution theory. Understanding these connections can help us recognize how biases develop and influence behavior in our social interactions. So let's define each key term first so we understand what we're working with, okay? So the definition for stereotype is generalized beliefs about a group of people. They simplify social information, but are often oversimplified and therefore inaccurate. The definition for prejudice is a negative attitude or belief about a group, often rooted in a stereotype. And lastly, discrimination is actions based on prejudice that result in unfair treatment of individuals or groups. Okay, let's look at the connection of all of that. Stereotypes often act as the foundation for prejudiced attitudes, which in turn then lead to discriminatory behaviors. Okay, so now we're going to break it into the role of attributions, okay? So stereotypes and prejudice are often linked to how we explain behavior through attribution theory. So let's start with dispositional attributions. People attribute others' behaviors to internal traits rather than external circumstances. For example, believing that someone is lazy because of their group affiliation, rather than considering situational factors like perhaps lack of resources or lack of opportunities. These biased attributions will reinforce stereotypes, making them feel justified and valid even when they're not. So let's look at the behavioral outcomes of this. When biased attributions are influenced by stereotype and prejudice, they can lead to harmful social outcomes. So first, we're going to look at perpetuation of stereotypes, which basically means attributing behavior to internal traits reinforces the stereotype, making it harder to challenge or change. Reinforcement of prejudice, this is the negative belief which becomes so ingrained and it leads to stronger prejudice attitudes over time. And discriminatory actions. These prejudiced attitudes manifest as unfair treatment or exclusion of individuals based on their group affiliation. Here's an example. If an employer assumes a candidate is unreliable based on a stereotype, they may not give that person a fair chance, reinforcing the discriminatory cycle. Why does this matter? Okay, understanding how stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination are connected and how they're influenced by biased attributions can help us become more aware of our thought processes. By questioning whether our judgments are based on stereotypes or situational factors, we can work towards fairer and more empathetic solutions in social interactions. Stereotypes may seem like mental shortcuts, but when they influence attributions, they can lead to prejudice and discrimination. So let's aim to challenge these biases and treat individuals based on their unique circumstances and not their generalized assumptions. So next up, let's talk about implicit attitudes. So this is a concept that explains how subconscious beliefs and can influence our thoughts and behaviors, even when we're not aware of them. So understanding implicit attitudes is crucial because they can shape how we judge and interact with others, often in unintended ways. So let's look at a definition first, because I really like to look at the definitions because then it helps us to sort of base what we want to learn about, right? So the definition, implicit attitudes are attitudes that individuals hold subconsciously or are unwilling to acknowledge. Unlike explicit attitudes, which we're aware of and we can control, implicit attitudes operate below the surface, influencing our perceptions and decisions without our conscious awareness. That was the definition. Let's look at the impact on attribution. Implicit attitudes play a big role in attribution theory, which focuses on how we explain other people's behaviors. So when implicit biases are at play, we may unconsciously make biased attributions, right? For example, a manager might subconsciously favor employees who belong to their own culture or social group when deciding on promotions, attributing success to their hard work while assuming others are less competent regardless of actual performance. This process can reinforce stereotypes and perpetuate discrimination, even when the individual doesn't intend to be unfair. So let's look at the research insight on this. Studies have shown that implicit attitudes often reflect negative evaluations of people from outgroups. And these subconscious biases basically strengthen stereotypes, increase the likelihood of discriminatory behavior, even when individuals consciously believe in fairness. So for example, research using the implicit association test, that's the IAT, has demonstrated that many people subconsciously associate certain groups with negative traits, even if they explicitly reject prejudice. So it's very strange, isn't it? But I mean, this is how our brains work. So recognizing implicit attitudes is really important because it helps us understand why well-meaning people might unintentionally act in biased ways, and awareness allows us to challenge and mitigate these biases, leading to a fairer and more inclusive behaviors. So implicit attitudes influence how we judge and treat others without even realizing it. So by becoming aware of their impact, we can work to minimize subconscious biases and create more equitable interactions. So some of the key biases that are related to attribution and stereotypes are, first of all, just world phenomenon. So this is the belief that people get what they deserve. So for example, assuming a victim of poverty caused their own misfortune. The second one is out of group homogeneity bias, perceiving out of group members as more similar than they actually are. So for example, all members of that particular group act the same way. The next one is in-group bias, and that's favoring members of one's own group over others. And this would be example of assuming colleagues from your own culture are more competent than the people of the other culture. And the last one is ethnocentrism, and this is believing one's own culture or group is superior. So for example, judging other people's traditions as inferior based on your own cultural norms. So now let's look at how attribution affects behavior and mental processes. So how do stereotypes and implicit attitudes affect both behavior and mental processes? These subconscious influences play an important role in shaping our interactions and our decisions. So let's start first with behavioral impact. Okay, so let's look at stereotypes and implicit attitudes, how they often influence how we behave towards others, even if we're not consciously aware of it. So exclusion or favoritism, this is implicit biases that can lead to treating some people unfairly and favoring other people based on a stereotype. So for example, avoiding someone because of a stereotype about their group, even if you've never interacted with them personally. So these behaviors reinforce divisions and can prevent genuine connections or opportunities for collaboration. So now let's look at the mental processes. So attributions, how we explain people's behaviors heavily shaped by stereotypes and biases, which can influence how we process our social information. And then what leads to skewed judgment, which implicit biases affect how we perceive, remember, and evaluate other people. Here's an example. You may focus on stereotype confirming behaviors while ignoring actions that contradict the stereotype. So this selective attention reinforces existing stereotypes, making it harder to overcome biased thinking. So by understanding how stereotypes and implicit attitudes influence our behavior and our mental processes, we can then take steps to reflect on how our own biases make it fairer or more accurate judgments. So stereotypes and implicit attitudes are powerful, but often subconscious. So recognizing their impact on our behavior and our thoughts is the first step towards more inclusive and equitable interactions. Okay, so now we're going to look at the practical applications and strategies to address biases. So whether it's implicit attitudes or attribution errors, understanding and challenging these biases can create more inclusive and fairer environments. So let's start with the applications. So using awareness to reduce bias, basically. So being aware of how attribution biases work is the first step in addressing them. So this knowledge can help us reduce prejudice and stereotypes in our everyday situations. So for example, many workplaces now implement implicit bias training to help employees recognize and address their subconscious biases. These programs encourage their decision-making skills, their fairness in hiring, promotions, and team collaboration. So let's look at some strategies on how to address bias. Number one, we need to encourage situational attribution, which is a focus on external factors that might explain someone's behavior instead of attributing to their personality or group membership. For example, instead of assuming someone is lazy for being late, consider situational factors like traffic or family responsibilities. The second one is practice in perspective taking. Actually trying to see situation from another person's point of view and to challenge the stereotypes and then therefore build empathy. So example, understanding the challenges of someone from a different culture or socioeconomic background faces that what they're facing basically can reduce our biased judgments. Okay, and the last one we're going to look at is promote contact and collaboration across the groups. So, encouraging interactions and teamwork between diverse groups helps reduce outgroup bias. For example, if you have team building activities in school or at the workplace, this can foster positive relationships and break down those stereotypes. So, by applying these strategies, we can create environments where people are judged fairly based on their individual actions and circumstances, rather than being influenced by biases or stereotypes. So, biases may be part of our human nature, but with awareness and effort, we can minimize their impact, whether it's through perspective taking, promoting collaboration, or shifting our attributions. These strategies can help us build more equitable relationships and communities. Okay, so let's summarize all of that into a little nutshell here. So, attribution theory explains how people interpret behavior, often influenced by stereotypes and implicit attitudes. And here are the key concepts that we covered in this video. Stereotypes simplify judgments but perpetuate biases. The implicit attitudes and biases shape attributions and social behavior. And understanding biases like just world phenomenon and in-group bias can help reduce prejudice. So here's our takeaway. Attribution theory highlights the importance of critical reflection on how we perceive and explain behaviors to promote fair and inclusive social interaction. So that was all the essential knowledge for 4.2 attitude formation and attitude change, the first CED question. There's a second one, so I'm going to do a second video right now so that you can get to know all the essential knowledge for that particular question. So this question was explain how attribution theory applies to behavior and mental processes. So hopefully you have a good understanding of how that happens now, and hopefully that you're prepared for your quiz, or if you get a question on the final exam, you'll be able to really talk about attribution theories and all of that. So if you did like the content, please hit that subscribe button for me. Thank you, or the like button. And if you have any questions, please do put them in the comments. I really love to hear from you guys, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Okay, thank you so much for listening today, and I'll see you next time.